November 19th, 1961, 300 p.m. The Arafura Sea off the coast of Dutch New Guinea. Michael Rockefeller felt the catamaran lurch beneath him, heard the crack of splitting wood, and then he was in the water. The ocean, warm as bathwater but dark as oil, swallowed him whole. When he surfaced, gasping, the overturned boat floated 20 feet away, its white hull gleaming against the grey sky like a whale's belly. "Swim!" René Wassing shouted from the other side of the wreckage. The Dutch anthropologist's voice carried across the water, high and tight with fear. Michael kicked hard, his legs heavy in his khaki pants and boots. His heart hammered against his ribs. Around them, the ocean stretched empty in every direction. No land, no boats, no help. Just water and sky and the distant rumble of thunder. They pulled themselves onto the capsized hull, their fingers scraping against barnacles. Michael's hands came away bloody, but he barely noticed. His mind was already calculating. 12 miles to shore, maybe more. The current was pulling them south, away from land, out toward open ocean. Behind them, somewhere beyond the horizon, lay the Asmat region. Villages of thatched huts, sago palms, and warriors who still remembered the old ways. "We need to stay with the boat," Wassing said, his teeth chattering despite the heat. "Someone will find us." Michael nodded, but his eyes never left the coastline he couldn't see. He was 23 years old, the son of Nelson Rockefeller, the grandson of the man who'd built Standard Oil and become America's first billionaire. He'd grown up in a 40-room mansion overlooking the Hudson River. He'd attended Phillips Exeter and Harvard. He'd dined with presidents and slept in beds worth more than most Americans earned in a year. None of that mattered now. The water around them was changing colour. Darker patches appeared and disappeared beneath the surface. Shadows that moved with purpose. "Sharks," Wassing whispered. Michael watched a dorsal fin slice through the water 30 yards away. Then another. The sharks were circling, patient and curious. They had time. The two men clinging to the overturned boat did not. Night fell fast in these waters. One moment the sky was grey, the next it was black. The stars emerged like ice chips scattered across velvet, beautiful and utterly indifferent. Michael and René huddled on the hull, their bodies pressed against the wood, listening to the ocean breathe around them. Every splash made them flinch. Every shadow was a shark. They didn't sleep. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. Michael's lips were cracked and bleeding. His tongue felt thick in his mouth. Salt crusted his skin, stinging every cut and scrape. The current had pulled them farther from land. He could tell by the angle of the sun, the patterns of the waves. "I'm going to swim for it," Michael said. Wassing turned to him, eyes wide. "What?" "The shore. I can make it." Michael's voice was rough but steady. He'd already made the decision hours ago, sometime in the dark when the sharks had bumped against the hull and he had realized they weren't going to wait forever. "Michael, no. We stay with the boat. They'll find us." "Who?" Michael gestured at the emptier horizon. "We've been out here 16 hours. No one knows where we are. The current's taking us out to sea." He pointed toward land, toward the faint green line that marked the coast. "That's 12 miles, maybe less. I'm a strong swimmer." He didn't mention the sharks. They both knew about the sharks. Michael removed his boots and tied 2 empty gas cans to his waist with rope, makeshift flotation devices. His hands shook as he worked the knots. Not from fear, or not just from fear, but from something else. Determination. The same quality that had driven his grandfather from poverty to power. The same stubborn refusal to accept fate that ran in Rockefeller blood. "Don't do this," Wassing said, his voice cracked. "Please." Michael looked at his companion, this Dutch scholar he'd known for only a few months. They'd travelled together through Asmat villages, documenting cultures that were vanishing as the modern world crept in. They'd shared meals of sago and fish, slept in huts while drums pounded through the jungle night, watched men in elaborate headdresses perform dances that were older than Christianity. "I'll send help," Michael said. "I promise." He slipped into the water before he could change his mind. The ocean embraced him, cool now in the early morning. He began to swim, his arms cutting through the water with the clean strokes he'd learned in the pool at Kykuit, the family estate where his childhood summers had been spent racing his siblings from one end to the other. Behind him, Wassing called out something, but the words were lost in the sound of waves. Michael didn't look back. He focused on the green line ahead, on the rhythm of his breathing, on the movement of his arms and legs. Stroke after stroke after stroke. The sharks followed. An hour passed, then 2. His shoulders burned, his legs felt like lead. The shore didn't seem any closer, but he kept swimming, because that was what Rockefellers did. They kept going. When his great-grandfather had started with nothing, he'd kept going. When his grandfather had been mocked and threatened, he'd kept going. When his father had lost election after election, he'd kept going. Michael Rockefeller kept swimming. The mist rolled in around noon, thick and white, swallowing the world. One moment he could see the shore, the next he was swimming through a cloud. He couldn't see 10 feet ahead, couldn't see behind him, couldn't see the sharks he knew were still there, circling, waiting, and then he was gone. 63 years later, on a cold afternoon in November, tourists walk through the rooms of Kykuit, the Rockefeller Estate that sits on a hill overlooking the Hudson River in New York. They admire the terraced gardens designed by William Wells Bosworth. They marvel at the Picasso tapestries hanging in the music room. They photograph the sculptures by Alexander Calder scattered across the lawns. In the dining room, they pause before a long table set for dinner. Chairs arranged around it as if waiting for guests who will never come. On the walls hang portraits of 4 generations of Rockefellers, men and women who shaped American industry, politics, and culture. One portrait stands out, a young man with dark hair and an easy smile. Michael Clark Rockefeller, 1938 to 1961. In the photograph, he's wearing khaki and standing among Asmat warriors, their faces painted white and black, their elaborate headdresses towering above them. He looks happy. He looks alive. The tour guide tells the story quickly, efficiently. Michael Rockefeller disappeared during an anthropological expedition to New Guinea. He was never found. His family never gave up hope. But what the guide doesn't say, what can't be said to tourists who've paid $30 for a glimpse of American royalty, is that Kykuit still feels like a house in waiting, that Michael's bedroom remains untouched, that his mother, until the day she died, set a place for him at every holiday dinner, that in the quiet hours when the mansion is empty and the guards have finished their rounds, staff members sometimes report hearing footsteps in the halls, the sound of someone swimming in the pool that hasn't been used in decades. The lookout on the hill is still watching, still waiting, still hoping that one day the son who swam into the mist will find his way home. But to understand how the world's richest family lost their son to the jungle, how infinite wealth couldn't save one young man from the ocean, we must go back to where it all began, to a time when Rockefeller wasn't a name that opened doors, it was a name that had to break them down, to the story of a boy born into poverty who swore he would conquer America, and did. Richford, New York, July 8, 1839. The boy who would become America's first billionaire was born in a 2-room wooden house that leaked when it rained. John Davison Rockefeller entered the world during a thunderstorm, his mother later said, as if God himself was announcing something important. But there was no silver spoon, no inheritance waiting, no fortune promised. There was only a struggling family in upstate New York and a father who was more often absent than present. William Avery Rockefeller, Devil Bill to those who knew him, was a con man. He sold fake cancer cure tonics to desperate farmers. He claimed to be a doctor, but had never attended medical school. He would disappear for months at a time, leaving his wife Eliza to raise 5 children alone on whatever money she could scrape together by taking in sewing and selling eggs. Young John learned early that he could not depend on his father. He could only depend on himself. "I will be the richest man in America," he told his mother when he was 10 years old. She was mending clothes by candlelight, her fingers raw from needlework. She looked at her serious son, this boy who already kept a small notebook where he recorded every penny he earned or spent, and she believed him. John was different from other children. While they played, he worked. At age 7, he raised turkeys and sold them for profit. At 12, he loaned a local farmer $50 at 7% interest, money he'd saved from doing odd jobs, and when the farmer paid him back with interest, John felt something that would drive him for the rest of his life, the thrill of money making money, capital working while he slept. He attended high school in Cleveland, Ohio, where the family had moved when the local community in New York grew tired of Devil Bill's schemes. John excelled at mathematics. He could calculate compound interest in his head faster than his teachers could write it on the blackboard. But he didn't go to college. His family couldn't afford it, and besides, John had already decided college was a waste of time that could be spent making money. At 16, he found work as an assistant bookkeeper at Hewitt & Tuttle, a commission merchant firm. His salary was 50 cents a day, $4 a week. He arrived before everyone else and left after everyone else had gone home. He found mistakes in the books that had cost the company thousands. He reorganized their entire accounting system. He never complained and never asked for time off. When he asked for a raise after 3 months of this, they offered him a $2 increase. He quit the next day. "I will never again work for wages," he declared. He was 17 years old. In 1859, John Rockefeller went into business for himself. He and a partner, Morris Clark, started a produce commission company with borrowed money. The Civil War erupted 2 years later, and while other young men marched off to battlefields, Rockefeller stayed in Cleveland, selling provisions to the Union Army. Flour, pork, grain, the army needed everything, and Rockefeller provided it at prices that were fair enough to keep contracts coming, but high enough to make serious profit. By the war's end, he'd made his first fortune. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Oil, that was the future. In 1859, the same year Rockefeller started his business, Edwin Drake struck oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Black gold, they called it. The beginning of a revolution. Oil for lamps, oil for machinery, oil for a country racing toward industrialization. The oil boom created overnight millionaires and left even more men bankrupt when wells dried up or prices crashed. Rockefeller saw chaos, and in chaos, he saw opportunity. In 1863, he invested $4,000 in a Cleveland oil refinery. Within 2 years, he'd bought out his partners and devoted himself entirely to oil. Not drilling, that was too risky, too dependent on luck. Refining, processing crude oil into kerosene, that was steady. That was controllable. That was where the real money lived. In 1870, at the age of 31, John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil Company. What happened next would make him the most powerful businessman in American history, and one of the most hated. Rockefeller's strategy was simple: consolidate everything. He bought competing refineries in Cleveland, one after another. When owners refused to sell, he undercut their prices until they faced bankruptcy, then bought them anyway. He negotiated secret deals with railroads, getting shipping rates so low that competitors couldn't match them. He built his own pipelines. He owned the tank cars that transported oil. He controlled every step from crude oil to the final product on the store shelves. "The day of individual competition is past and gone," he declared. "Cooperation is the order of the day." But his critics call it something else: monopoly, ruthlessness, the destruction of the American dream. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled 90% of America's oil refineries. 90%? The company refined 24 million barrels of crude oil a year. Rockefeller's personal wealth had grown beyond comprehension. He was worth millions, then tens of millions, then hundreds of millions. And he was only 41 years old. His competitors told stories about Kykuit with a mixture of fear and grudging admiration. How he never forgot a number. How he could recite profit margins from years ago without consulting a ledger. How he attended Baptist church every Sunday and taught Bible study, preaching about honesty and Christian values, then went to work on Monday and crushed anyone who stood in his way. "God gave me my money," Rockefeller would say when critics accused him of greed. He genuinely believed it. Divine providence had made him wealthy, and it was his duty to use that wealth wisely. And use it he did. He gave away millions to charity. He founded the University of Chicago, donated to medical research that would eventually eradicate hookworm in the American South, established foundations that would continue his philanthropic work for generations. By the time he died, he would give away more than $500 million, about 80% of his fortune. But his greatest monument wouldn't be a university or a foundation. It would be a house, a palace, a declaration carved in stone that the Rockefeller family had arrived and would endure forever. In 1893, John D. Rockefeller bought a plot of land in Pocantico Hills, New York. Rolling hills overlooking the Hudson River, ancient trees and clear streams, land that had once belonged to Dutch settlers who'd named the area for the creek that ran through it, Pocantico, meaning stream between two hills. It was perfect. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., would eventually build Kykuit there, the estate that would house 4 generations of Rockefellers, the lookout on the hill, the symbol of everything the family had achieved. But in 1893, as the elder Rockefeller walked those hills for the first time, breathing in the clean country air so different from Cleveland's industrial smoke, he had no way of knowing what that house would one day witness. What tragedies would unfold within its walls, what losses even his vast fortune couldn't prevent. In 1911, the Supreme Court ordered the breakup of Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The monopoly was split into 34 separate companies. Instead of destroying Rockefeller, it made him even wealthier. The individual companies' stock values soared. By 1913, John D. Rockefeller's personal fortune reached $900 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's nearly $400 billion today. The richest man in modern history. The first American billionaire. He controlled 2% of the entire US economy. He had the power to move markets with a word, to make or break entire industries, to influence presidents and governors. His wealth was so vast it seemed almost abstract, numbers too large to comprehend, power too great to challenge. But money, for all its might, has limits. It can buy mansions and art and influence. It can fund universities and cure diseases. It can build empires that span continents. What it cannot buy is control over fate. It cannot protect the ones you love from their own choices. It cannot reach into the ocean and pull back a young man who swims into the mist. It cannot answer the question that would haunt the Rockefeller family for generations. Could all that money, all that power, all that influence, all those billions, protect the ones they loved? Or would their fortune become a monument to what wealth cannot buy? A reminder that some losses are beyond even the richest family's ability to prevent? Pocantico Hills, New York. Spring 1906. John D. Rockefeller Jr. stood on the highest point of his father's 3,400-acre estate and looked out across the Hudson River Valley. From here, on a clear day, you could see 50 miles in every direction. The river wound like a silver ribbon through green hills. Church steeples dotted distant villages. The Palisades rose like ancient walls across the water. Kykuit, he said aloud, testing the Dutch word on his tongue. The lookout. It was the perfect name for the house he would build here. A house that would watch over the empire his father had created. A house that would stand for generations. A house that would prove the Rockefeller family wasn't just rich. They were permanent. Junior, as everyone called him, was 32 years old and had recently married Abby Aldrich, the daughter of a Rhode Island senator. Unlike his father, who'd spent his life building Standard Oil, Junior had no interest in business. His passion was architecture, art, and the careful stewardship of the family fortune. He would not expand the empire, he would preserve it, beautify it, make it meaningful, and he would start with Kykuit. He hired the architectural firm of Delano and Aldrich, no relation to his wife despite the shared surname. William Adams, Delano, and Chester Holmes Aldrich were two of New York's most sought-after architects, known for their elegant Georgian revival designs. Junior gave them specific instructions. The house should be substantial but not ostentatious. It should reflect old money, not new. It should look like it had stood there for centuries, even though every brick would be freshly laid. Construction began in 1908. The workers came first, hundreds of them. Italian stonemasons who had crossed the ocean with skills were passed down through generations, carpenters who could coax wood into curves that seemed impossible, plasterers who transformed ceilings into works of art. They built a small village on the property to house themselves, and every morning they climbed the hill to work on the mansion that would define their careers. The house rose slowly, deliberately. The foundation alone took 6 months. Massive blocks of stone sunk deep into bedrock. Junior visited the site daily, walking through rooms that existed only as wooden frames, imagining the life that would fill them. His father came less often, but when he did, he would stand silent, hands clasped behind his back, nodding approval. By 1913, Kykuit was complete. The main house contained 40 rooms, though that number didn't include the countless closets, storage spaces, and service areas hidden behind walls and beneath floors. The exterior was Pennsylvania fieldstone, each piece carefully selected and fitted by hand. The walls were 2 feet thick in places, solid, permanent, or good, built to last 1,000 years. The architectural style was Georgian revival with classical touches. 4 stories tall, the house rose with perfect symmetry. Windows marched in orderly rows across the facade. A porte-cochere welcomed visitors arriving in motorcars, a modern convenience that was still rare in 1913. The entrance doors were solid oak, 10 feet tall, with bronze handles that would develop a patina over decades of hands pushing them open. Inside, the grand hall took your breath away. The floor was cream-coloured marble imported from Italy. The walls were panelled in dark mahogany that had been aged for 10 years before installation. A staircase swept upward in a gentle curve, its banister carved from a single piece of wood. The rooms flowed one into another with the careful precision of a symphony. The drawing room featured silk wallpaper hand-painted in China. The music room held a Steinway grand piano and walls designed specifically to enhance acoustics. The library contained floor-to-ceiling bookshelves made from French walnut, with a rolling ladder to reach the highest volumes. Junior's private study overlooked the Hudson, with windows positioned to catch morning light. Abby's sitting room was decorated in pale yellows and creams, with furniture she'd personally selected in Paris. The dining room could seat 24 guests at a table that required 6 men to move it. Below ground, accessible by a hidden staircase, was a complete world most visitors never saw: a bowling alley, an indoor swimming pool lined with emerald green tiles, a squash court, storage rooms filled with wine, a basement so vast you could get lost in it. But it was the gardens that transformed Kykuit from impressive to transcendent. Junior hired William Wells Bosworth, a landscape architect who'd studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Bosworth spent 3 years creating terraced gardens that cascaded down the hill like green waterfalls. Classical sculptures lined gravel paths, Greek gods and Roman emperors watching over roses and peonies. Fountains sent water high into the air, catching sunlight in their spray. The gardens covered 250 acres, required a staff of 40 men to maintain. There were formal gardens with geometric patterns so precise they looked like embroidery from above. There were wild gardens where native plants grew in carefully controlled chaos. There were secret gardens hidden behind hedges, intimate spaces where family members could escape the grandeur and simply sit in peace. One garden was designed entirely around a sculpture collection that would grow over the decades. Modern art, Picasso, Calder, Moore, would eventually stand among the classical pieces, creating a conversation across centuries. Junior believed great art should be lived with, walked past daily, not locked away in museums. The cost of building Kykuit exceeded $2 million, equivalent to roughly $60 million today. But Junior never considered it excessive. He was creating something permanent, something that would outlast him and his children and his children's children, a monument not to ego, but to endurance. The family moved in during the summer of 1913. John D. Rockefeller Sr., now 74 years old and white-haired, walked through the completed house with the slow steps of age. He paused in the grand hall, looking up at the chandelier that hung from the ceiling like a frozen waterfall of crystal. "It's good," he said. That was all, but from him it meant everything. The golden age of Kykuit had begun. Through the 20s and 30s, the house fulfilled every promise Junior had imagined. Presidents visited Coolidge, Hoover, Roosevelt. Artists and musicians performed in the music room. Scholars debated in the library. Children, Junior's 6 children, ran through the halls and played hide-and-seek in the gardens. The house rang with laughter and music and the sound of life being lived abundantly. John D. Rockefeller Sr. died at Kykuit in 1937 at the age of 97. He passed peacefully in his sleep, in the bedroom he'd occupied every summer since the house opened. His funeral was attended by thousands, but the family buried him simply as he'd requested. No monument beyond the life he'd lived, no marker grander than his name. The house continued. Junior's children grew up and had children of their own. Nelson Rockefeller, the second son, became governor of New York and later vice president of the United States. He married and had 5 children. The third was named Michael. In old photographs from the 1940s and 50s, you can see Michael as a boy running across Kykuit's lawns, building forts in the gardens, swimming in the pool beneath the mansion, standing on the terrace with his siblings, the Hudson River stretching out behind them like a promise of endless possibilities. It was a magical childhood, lived in a palace that seemed invincible, where nothing bad could happen, where wealth and privilege created a shield against the world's darkness. But darkness has a way of finding its way in, even to places that seem safest. And Kykuit, for all its beauty and permanence, was not immune. The house that was built to protect couldn't protect forever. The lookout on the hill would soon be watching for someone who would never return. May 18th, 1938. Kykuit Estate. Michael Clark Rockefeller was born in a 4th-floor bedroom overlooking the Hudson River. The room had witnessed the births of his 4 older siblings, and it would witness one more after him. But Michael's arrival felt different the nurses would later say. He came into the world screaming with unusual vigour, as if already protesting the life that had been planned for him. His father, Nelson Rockefeller, was 30 years old and already carving his path toward power. Handsome, charismatic, ambitious, Nelson would become governor of New York, serve as vice president under Gerald Ford, and spend his entire life pursuing the presidency he never quite reached. His mother, Mary Todd Hunter Clark, known as Todd, came from Philadelphia society. She was elegant, reserved, and utterly devoted to maintaining the family's public image. Michael was their third child and second son. In the Rockefeller family, that meant something specific. The firstborn son inherited the weight of family legacy. The second son had more freedom. But the third child, especially a boy, occupied a strange middle ground. Important enough to carry the family name, but far enough down the line to potentially forge his own path, if he dared. Young Michael grew up in rooms filled with priceless art. He learned to walk on marble floors that cost more than most Americans' homes. He celebrated birthdays with cakes big enough to feed a village. But he also grew up under the constant weight of a single question. What will you do with the Rockefeller name? His grandfather, John D. Rockefeller Jr., would take Michael on walks through Kykuit's gardens, pointing out sculptures and flowers with equal reverence. "We are stewards," Junior would tell him. "This isn't ours to waste. It's ours to preserve and pass on." Michael nodded but said little. Even as a child, he understood he was supposed to feel grateful, privileged, blessed, and he did. But he also felt something else, something he couldn't name yet, a restlessness, a hunger for something these marble halls couldn't provide. School came easily. He attended Buckley School in New York City, then Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, the same path his father and uncles had walked. His grades were good but not exceptional. He excelled at sports, particularly swimming. In the pool cutting through water with clean strokes, he felt a freedom that eluded him everywhere else. His teachers noted that Michael asked unusual questions. During history lessons, while our other boys focused on dates and battles, Michael wanted to know about the people who'd lost the wars, the tribes that had been conquered, the cultures that had vanished. What happened to them, he would ask. Where did they go? At 15, during a family trip to Mexico, Michael spent hours in a small museum in Mexico City, mesmerized by Aztec artifacts, stone masks, jade jewelry, obsidian knives. His family moved through the exhibits quickly. They had dinner reservations, but Michael lingered, studying each piece as if it held secrets he desperately needed to learn. "Why are you so interested in dead cultures?" his brother Stephen asked. "They're not dead," Michael replied. "They're just forgotten. There's a difference." In 1956, at 18, Michael enrolled at Harvard University. His father had gone to Dartmouth, breaking family tradition. Michael chose Harvard, partly to assert his own independence, partly because their anthropology department was among the best in the world. Anthropology, the study of human cultures, past and present. His parents accepted this choice with barely concealed disappointment. Rockefellers studied economics, law, political science, subjects that prepared you to run the world. They didn't study obscure tribes and primitive art. But Michael had found his passion, and he pursued it with the same determination his great-grandfather had once applied to oil. He spent his summers on archaeological digs in Mexico and Peru. He learned to speak basic Spanish and Portuguese. He read everything he could find about indigenous cultures, particularly those still untouched by Western civilization. "There are people living today exactly as their ancestors lived 1,000 years ago," he told his roommate. "Can you imagine? No electricity, no modern medicine, no connection to the outside world. Pure culture, unchanged. How can anyone not find that fascinating?" His roommate, who was studying pre-law, looked at him like he was insane. In his senior year, Michael learned about the Asmat people of Dutch New Guinea, a tribe of warriors who lived in the jungle along the southwestern coast. They were headhunters, practitioners of ritual cannibalism, artists who carved intricate wooden sculptures that were considered among the most powerful primitive art in the world. The Asmat believed that all death was murder, caused by enemies or malevolent spirits. To restore balance, they needed to take a head, actual headhunting, or carve a memorial sculpture. Their entire culture revolved around death, art, and revenge. Michael was transfixed. "I want to go there," he told his anthropology professor. "I want to document them before they're gone." "It's dangerous," the professor warned. "The Dutch government barely controls that region. The Asmat still kill outsiders. Just last year a priest disappeared. They never found his body." "All the more reason to go now," Michael said, "before it's too late." He graduated from Harvard in June '60. His family threw a party at Kykuit, 200 guests, champagne, a string quartet playing in the gardens. Everyone congratulated him and asked what was next. Business school, law school, politics? "I'm going to New Guinea," Michael announced. The garden went quiet, his father's. Smile froze. His mother's hand trembled as she set down her champagne glass. "For how long?" Nelson asked carefully. "As long as it takes to build a collection for the Museum of Primitive Art." The museum was a Rockefeller project funded by the family. Michael was offering this as a compromise. He would go to the jungle, but for family purposes. Nelson Rockefeller looked at his son, this 22-year-old who had his mother's gentle eyes but something else underneath, something wild and unreachable. "At least come back in one piece," Nelson finally said. Michael smiled. "I promise." In October 1960, Michael flew to New Guinea. He brought cameras, notebooks, money to buy art, and a determination to prove he could be more than just another Rockefeller heir collecting dividends. He wanted to do something that mattered, something real, something that wasn't handed to him but earned. He hired guides and translators. He travelled up muddy rivers in dugout canoes. He slept in villages where the houses stood on stilts above swamps. He ate sago palm and grilled fish. He watched ceremonies where men painted their faces white and black, where drums pounded through the night, where warriors danced with spears and sang songs about ancestors and enemies. He was careful. He respected local customs. He paid fairly for art. He learned basic phrases in the Asmat language. The villagers called him the young master from across the sea. He wrote letters home every week, long, detailed accounts of what he was seeing. "I've never felt more alive," he wrote to his mother in September 1961. "This is what I was meant to do." In late October, he travelled to the village of Otsjanep, deep in Asmat territory. He wanted to photograph a sacred ceremony and buy more sculptures for the museum collection. He hired a Dutch anthropologist named René Wassing to accompany him. Wassing was experienced, cautious, knowledgeable about the region. On November 17th, they loaded their supplies into a catamaran and set out along the coast. The last photograph of Michael Rockefeller was taken on November 18th, 1961. In it, he stands among Asmat warriors outside a longhouse. The warriors wear elaborate headdresses made from bird-of-paradise feathers. Their faces are painted white with sacred clay. They hold spears taller than they are. Michael stands in the centre, wearing khaki shorts and a white shirt. His hair is slightly long, his face tanned and happy. He's smiling at the camera with the easy confidence of someone who believes the world is fundamentally good, that his goodwill and respect will protect him, that his name, Rockefeller, carries weight even here, in this jungle where his family's billions mean nothing. He had no way of knowing that within 24 hours he would be swimming for his life through shark-infested waters, that the warriors in this photograph knew things he didn't, that some debts are paid in blood and some cultures practice justice the modern world, has forgotten, that the ocean he would soon enter would become his grave, that his family's infinite wealth would prove powerless against 12 miles of dark water and the secrets that waited on the shore. The morning began with promise. Michael Rockefeller and René Wassing loaded their catamaran before dawn, the sky still dark but beginning to lighten at the edges. They'd spent the night in the village of Otsjanep, sleeping in a longhouse while drums had pounded rhythms that seemed to come from the earth itself. Michael had recorded everything in his notebook, the ceremony, the masks, the dances. His cameras held photographs that would astound the Museum of Primitive Art. Now it was time to return to their base camp along the coast. The catamaran was 20 feet long, made from 2 dugout canoes lashed together with a platform across the middle. Not ideal for ocean travel, but it was what they had. They loaded their supplies, cameras, film, notebooks, the wooden sculptures Michael had purchased from the villagers, containers of fresh water, some dried fish. "The weather looks uncertain," Wassing said, studying the grey sky. Michael glanced up. Clouds hung low and heavy, but he'd seen worse. "We'll be fine. It's only about 25 miles along the coast." They pushed off at 7 in the morning. The Arafura Sea was calm at first, dark and smooth as glass. Michael sat cross-legged on the platform, reviewing his notes from the previous night. Wassing handled the outboard motor, a small engine that sputtered and coughed but kept them moving at a steady pace. By noon the weather had turned. The wind picked up from the south, pushing against them. The water grew choppy. Waves that had been gentle swells became something more aggressive, slapping against the catamaran's hulls. The outboard motor strained, its noise rising to a whine. "We should move closer to shore," Wassing shouted over the wind. Michael nodded, but as Wassing tried to steer towards the land, a strong current grabbed them. The ocean here, where the Islandan Riviera met the sea, created treacherous conditions. Fresh water pouring from the jungle collided with saltwater tides, creating currents that could pull a boat miles off course in minutes. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, everything went wrong. A wave larger than the others rose up seemingly from nowhere. The catamaran rode up its face, tilted at an impossible angle, hung there for a heartbeat, and then the platform that held the two dugouts together snapped. Michael heard the crack of breaking wood, felt the world shift beneath him, and then he was in the water. The ocean swallowed him, warm and dark. He kicked hard, broke the surface gasping, and looked around wildly. The two dugout canoes had separated and were already drifting apart. Wassing surfaced 10 valuable feet away, coughing up seawater. Between them, their supplies floated in a spreading circle, cameras sinking, notebooks dissolving, wooden sculptures bobbing like bizarre fish. "The boat!" Michael shouted. They swam to the nearest dugout and managed to flip it hull up. It wouldn't support both their weights if they tried to sit on it, but they could cling to the sides. Michael grabbed one end, Wassing the other. Around them, the ocean stretched empty in every direction. The shore was somewhere to the north, but Michael couldn't tell how far. 2 miles, 5, 12? The current was pulling them south, away from land out toward open water. "We stay with the boat," Wassing said, his voice tight. "Someone will see us. A fishing boat, a patrol, we just have to wait." Michael wanted to believe that, but they were in one of the most remote regions on Earth. Dutch colonial control barely extended this far. The Asmat villages they'd visited had no radios, no telephones. No one knew exactly where they were. The afternoon wore on. The sun, hidden behind clouds, began its descent. Michael's arms ached from gripping the wood. His legs cramped from kicking to stay afloat. Salt water stung his eyes and cracked his lips. And then Wassing said the word that made Michael's blood turn cold. Sharks. Michael saw them, dark shadows moving beneath the surface, circling with patient curiosity. Dorsal fins cutting through the water. 1 shark, then 2, then more. Tiger sharks, probably, or bulls. Both species were common in these waters. Both were known to attack humans. The sharks didn't rush in. They circled, keeping their distance, waiting. Michael had read about shark behavior. They investigated potential prey carefully, sometimes for hours, before deciding whether to attack. The question was whether 2 men clinging to an overturned boat looked enough like prey. Night fell fast. One moment the sky was grey, the next it was black. Stars emerged, sharp and cold. The ocean became a living thing around them, breathing, moving, whispering. Every splash made them flinch. Every bump against the hull sent terror through their bodies. They didn't sleep. How could they? The sharks were still there, invisible now, but present. Michael could feel them moving through the water, displacing currents that touched his legs. Once, something large brushed against his foot, and he nearly screamed. Wassing prayed in Dutch, the words tumbling over themselves. Michael didn't pray. He calculated. The current was steady, about 2 knots. They had been in the water for maybe 10 hours. That meant they'd drifted at least 20 miles from where they'd capsized. The shore was impossibly far now. Dawn came with agonizing slowness. The sky lightened from black to grey to pale pink. Michael's tongue was swollen in his mouth. Every muscle screamed. He'd been in the water for 16 hours, and the shore, when he could finally see it, was farther away than it had been the previous afternoon. "I'm going to swim for it," Michael said. Wassing's head snapped toward him. "What?" "The shore. I can make it." Michael's voice was rough, barely above a whisper. His throat felt like sandpaper. "Michael, no. We stay with the boat. The current's taking us out to sea. We're farther from land now than we were yesterday. In another day, we'll be so far out no one will ever find us." Michael was already working the rope that held the gas cans. There were 2 5-gallon cans, empty now, that had held fuel for the motor. He tied them around his waist for flotation. The sharks. I know about the sharks. Michael removed his boots, his movements deliberate. I'm a strong swimmer. The shore is maybe 12 miles. I can do 12 miles. Please, Wassing's voice cracked. Please don't do this. Michael looked at his companion, this Dutch scholar who'd become a friend over the past months, who'd taught him Asmat phrases and local customs, who had laughed at his jokes and shared his enthusiasm for primitive art. I'll send help, Michael said. I promise. He lowered himself into the water. The ocean embraced him, cooler now in the early morning. For a moment, he held onto the dugout, gathering his courage. Then he let go. He began to swim. The strokes came automatically, skills learned in Kykuit's pool, practiced over years. Pull, breathe, pull, breathe. His arms cut through the water. His legs kicked steadily. The 2 gas cans bobbed on either side of his waist, providing just enough buoyancy to keep him from having to work too hard to stay afloat. Behind him, Wassing's voice called out something, but the words were lost in the sound of waves. Michael swam toward the green line of shore, stroke after stroke. Don't think about the distance. Don't think about the sharks. Don't think about how the current might be pushing you sideways even as you swim forward. Just swim. An hour passed. The shore didn't seem any closer. His shoulders burned. The salt water had rubbed his skin raw where the rope held the gas cans, but he kept swimming because stopping meant drowning, and Rockefellers didn't quit. 2 hours, 3 years, the sun climbed, higher, beating down on his head. His lips cracked and bled. He swallowed seawater by accident and retched it back up. Around noon, the mist rolled in. It came from nowhere, thick and white, swallowing the world. One moment Michael could see the shore ahead and the boat far behind. The next moment he was swimming through a cloud. Visibility dropped to 10 feet, then 5, then nothing. He kept swimming in what he thought was the right direction. But without landmarks, without the sun to guide him, he could have been swimming in circles. The sharks followed. He knew they were there even when he couldn't see them, felt them moving through the water below him, waiting. The mist thickened, and then Michael Rockefeller, 23 years old, heir to the greatest fortune in American history, grandson of the man who'd built an empire in a palace, vanished into the white. 12 hours later, a fishing boat found René Wassing still clinging to the overturned dugout. He was delirious, sunburned, barely conscious. When he could finally speak, he told them about Michael. He swam, Wassing said. Yesterday morning, toward shore. I tried to stop him. The news reached Nelson Rockefeller in New York the next morning. The governor of New York, one of the most powerful men in America, received a telegram that every parent dreads. Your son is missing. Nelson mobilized everything. The Dutch government sent military helicopters. Planes crisscrossed the coastline and jungle. Boats searched every mile of ocean between where the catamaran had capsized and the nearest shore. The Rockefeller fortune, usually capable of buying anything, was thrown at the problem with desperate urgency. They searched for 2 weeks. They found nothing. No body, no gas cans, no clothing, no trace that Michael Rockefeller had ever existed except for the testimony of one Dutch anthropologist and the photographs left behind in New York. The official conclusion: drowned, lost at sea. The ocean had taken him. But in Asmat villages, different stories began to circulate. Stories told in whispers around night fires. Stories the Dutch authorities didn't want to hear. Some villagers claimed they'd seen a white man come ashore that morning, exhausted, barely conscious. Claimed warriors from Otsjanep had been waiting. Claimed there had been drums that night. The kind of drums that meant something important was happening. Claimed they'd heard screaming. The Asmat practiced ritual cannibalism. When enemies were killed, their bodies were prepared in specific ways. The head was taken as a trophy. The brain was eaten. The flesh was distributed among warriors. It was how they restored balance, how they honored the dead, how they became powerful, and there was a debt to be paid. Years earlier, Dutch colonial police had killed several Asmat warriors in a raid on Otsjanep. The village had never forgotten. In Asmat culture, all death required revenge. A life for a life. A white man for white men. Michael Rockefeller, swimming through the mist towards a shore, would have had no way of knowing any of this. Would have seen the beach ahead and felt relief. Would have crawled onto the sand gasping, victorious, thinking he'd made it, thinking he'd survived. On March 23, 1864, Michael Rockefeller was declared legally dead. His family held a memorial service at Riverside Church in Manhattan. 2,000 people attended. The governor wept, but they never stopped wondering, never stopped hoping, never fully accepted that he was gone. Because the truth, if the whispered stories from Asmat villages were true, was far darker than drowning. The truth was a nightmare that no amount of money could fix, a secret the family never wanted to know. Nelson Rockefeller never spoke publicly about his son's death. In the months and years after Michael disappeared, reporters would ask the governor about the tragedy. Nelson would look at them with eyes that had gone somewhere distant, somewhere unreachable, and say simply, "We prefer not to discuss it." Then he would turn to the next question, the next policy issue, the next crisis that required his attention. But those who knew him well saw the change. The man who'd been so vibrant, so ambitious, so utterly convinced of his destiny to be president, had a piece carved out of him that never grew back. He continued his political career, became vice president under Gerald Ford in 1974, but friends said the fire had dimmed. Part of him remained in New Guinea, swimming through mist, searching for a son who would never come home. His wife Todd took it differently. She didn't retreat into silence, she retreated into ritual. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every family gathering at Kykuit, she set a place for Michael, an empty chair at the table, a plate that would never be filled, silverware arranged just so. He might come back, she would say when family members gently suggested she stop. He might walk through that door any day. She died in 1976, 15 years after Michael disappeared, still setting that empty place. Kykuit itself became a kind of shrine. Michael's bedroom on the 4th floor remained exactly as he'd left it in October 1960. His books still lined the shelves, volumes on anthropology, primitive art, South Pacific cultures. His Harvard diploma hung on the wall. Photographs from his childhood covered the dresser, Michael swimming in the pool below the mansion, Michael in the gardens with his siblings, Michael standing on the terrace looking out at the Hudson River. The family kept his art collection on display. The Asmat sculptures he had sent back before that final trip were exhibited in the same room where John D. Rockefeller Sr. had once displayed Renaissance painting, wooden figures carved by warriors who might have killed the man who'd bought them. The irony was not lost on anyone. Nelson died in 1979 of a heart attack. He was 70 years old and had never stopped wondering what had really happened to his son. Did Michael drown in the ocean, as the official report claimed? Or did he make it to shore? And if he made it to shore, what then? The questions haunted the family for decades. Then in 2014, a journalist named Carl Hoffman published a book that changed everything. Hoffman had spent years researching Michael's disappearance. He'd travelled to New Guinea, lived in Asmat villages, learned the language, gained the trust of elders who remembered in 61, and slowly, carefully, he'd assembled the pieces of what had really happened. The story that emerged was darker than drowning. According to multiple Asmat witnesses who spoke to Hoffman, men who were young warriors in 1961 but were now elderly and willing to talk, Michael Rockefeller had made it to shore. Exhausted, barely conscious, he'd crawled onto the beach near the village of Otsjanep just as the sun was rising. Warriors had been waiting. Years earlier, in New 58, Dutch colonial police had raided Otsjanep, killing 5 Asmat men in retaliation for an attack on a Dutch official. In Asmat culture, such a debt could never be forgotten. All death was murder. All murder required revenge, a life for a life. The warriors didn't care that this white man wasn't Dutch military, didn't care that he'd come with respect, with money for their art, with genuine interest in their culture. He was white, he came from the same world as those who'd killed their people, and he'd walked onto their shore alone, a gift from the gods. What happened next was ritual, not cruelty. According to the witnesses, Michael was killed quickly with a spear through the chest. Then his body was prepared according to ancient customs. The head was severed and kept as a trophy. The brain was removed and cooked. The flesh was cut from the bones and distributed among the warriors who'd participated. Nothing was wasted. Everything had manner and meaning. It wasn't murder in their eyes, it was justice. It was how balance was. Restored. It was how the dead were honoured and the living made powerful. One elder told Hoffman that he'd personally participated. Another claimed to have kept Michael's skull for decades, eventually trading it to another village. A third described in detail how the body had been prepared, using words that matched exactly the anthropological records of Asmat funeral rites. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Hoffman couldn't prove definitively that Michael had been killed and eaten, but the testimony was consistent, detailed, and came from multiple independent sources who had no reason to lie. In fact, they were risking social ostracism by revealing what had happened. When Hoffman's book was published, the Rockefeller family said nothing. No statement, no confirmation, no denial, just silence, the same silence Nelson had maintained for decades. But privately, those close to the family said the book brought a kind of terrible closure. Not peace, there could be no peace in near such a truth, but an end to wondering. An answer, however dark, to questions that had tortured them for 50 years. Michael Rockefeller had not drowned. He had not been lost to the ocean. He had reached land. And what happened there was exactly what he'd spent years studying, what he'd travelled halfway around the world to document. He'd become part of the culture he'd so desperately wanted to understand. The irony was almost unbearable. Today, Kykuit stands as a National Historic Landmark, owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Tours run daily from May through November. Visitors pay $35 to walk through rooms where 4 generations of Rockefellers lived, where presidents dined and artists gathered, where one of America's most powerful families built their legacy. The tour guides tell sanitized stories. They point out the Picasso tapestries and Calder sculptures. They explain the architectural significance of the gardens. They mention Michael. Rockefeller briefly disappeared in New Guinea in 1961, never found, and then moved quickly to the next room. But what they don't tell you is that Kykuit feels like a house in waiting. The staff members who maintain the property, the ones who work there year after year, tell different stories when the tourists are gone. They talk about doors that open by themselves, about footsteps in empty hallways, always on the 4th floor, always near Michael's room, about the sound of splashing from the underground pool late at night when no one is swimming. One security guard who worked nights for 15 years swears he once saw a young man in khaki shorts standing on the terrace, looking out at the Hudson River. When the guard called out, the figure turned, and the guard saw Michael Rockefeller's face, exactly as it appeared in the photographs. Then the figure simply vanished, dissolving into morning mist. "I put in my 2 weeks' notice the next day," the guard said. "The reports aren't constant. Months will pass with nothing unusual. Then someone will hear it again. Footsteps, splashing. Oh no. Doors opening. Always subtle. Always just at the edge of perception. As if someone is there but not quite there. Present but not fully arrived. The rational explanation is, old houses make noises. Wind causes doors to move. Memory and expectation create ghosts where none exist. But there's another possibility. Perhaps Michael Rockefeller, after 63 years, has finally found his way home. Not in body. That body was dispersed in an Asmat village decades ago, given to the jungle and the river and the warriors who needed it for their rituals. But in spirit, in the part of us that can't be killed or eaten or lost to the ocean. Perhaps he's walked every road back, swum every current, crossed every impossible distance, and arrived at last at Kykuit, the lookout on the hill, the house where he was born and raised and loved, where his bedroom still waits with his books on the shelves, where his art still hangs on walls that remember him, where an empty chair still stands at the family table, permanently set for a dinner that was supposed to happen 60 years ago. The Rockefeller family built an empire to last forever. John D. Rockefeller Sr. started with nothing and died worth hundreds of billions in today's money. He controlled 2% of the entire American economy. He shaped the modern world with oil and railroads and philanthropy. He built Kykuit to prove that his family had arrived, that they would endure, that their name would never be forgotten. And in all of that, he was successful. But here is what all that money couldn't buy. The guarantee that the ones you love will be safe. The power to reach across an ocean and pull back a sun who swims into the mist. The ability to rewrite a story that ends in tragedy instead of triumph. Michael Rockefeller was 23 years old when he disappeared. He was bright and curious and brave and perhaps a little reckless. He wanted to do something meaningful with his life, something that mattered beyond the fortune he had inherited. He wanted to understand cultures that were vanishing, to preserve what was being lost, to prove he was more than just his name, and in the end he succeeded too. His art collection is in the Metropolitan Museum. His photographs document a world that no longer exists, the Asmat of 1961, before Christianity and modernization changed everything. His story reminds us that privilege is not protection, that wealth cannot shield us from fate, that some journeys end in darkness no matter how much light we carry with us. Kykuit still stands on its hill, still watching over the Hudson River. The gardens still bloom in careful succession. The fountains still send water skyward. The house endures exactly as it was designed to do, but it endures in waiting. For the sound of footsteps that might be the wind, for splashing in an empty pool that might be old pipes, for the figure on the terrace that might be memory or longing, or the ghost of a young man who swam into the mist and never came back. Until perhaps now. Welcome home, Michael. The lookout has been watching for you.